So I'm hosting this event today from Canberra in Australia, and I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country, to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting this event, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So we're joined by Mike, who I imagine many of you know, but for those who do not, Mike has helped scores of photographers over the years in a variety of positions, educational, editing, and so on. He was the director of the Alexia Grant competition, an endowed faculty member at Syracuse University in New York State, and extensive experience in Washington at National Geographic and the White House as a visual editor. So fantastic to have you with us, Mike. You're joining us from Minneapolis today. Can you just flesh out a little bit more about your background and your experience, particularly the sort of experience you had both in the White House and National Geographic in the editing work that you
did? I guess everything I've ever done was like each place I was able to learn things. The environment and the people I worked with taught me things. At National Geographic, that was the first time I'd stepped up on a national level, and it was in the 90s, so some time ago. And the biggest thing I learned there was that geography drives everything. So how do you make photographs that speak to multiple dimensions simultaneously with geography at the heart of the imagery? And what is it that makes geography tell stories? It's a hard thing to codify. One example, story on Turkey, the lead image was an oil wrestling competition that had existed for centuries, and overhead was the flag of Turkey. So here we were in a country that was the only country in the world that's both in Asia and Europe, and that is what, 90-some% Muslim and yet secular. So it's this country full of contradictions, and trying to convey that notion in a photograph was the challenge. The White House was trying to, it's always a matter of what is the greatest thing you can accomplish in a given setting. And at the White House, it was not just like the daily flow of things, but trying to think of the 4 years that I was there as helping the photographers create an archive of the presidency that made a statement beyond what happened. So we would do things like, we suspected that a war was going to start sometime after 9/11 and had some sense maybe a week or two in advance. So we talked about, we should probably photograph aspects of the White House, life of the White House, that don't typically get photographed even by the official photographers. So there are images in the archive that speak to what it was like to be in that setting at the beginnings of a war. So always, like in newspapers, I try to think, okay, this is a newspaper, but can we produce work at a level of a magazine? And then the projects, can they be as dimensional as a book? Joe Cavaretta made this one amazing project back in Albuquerque days. That was literally could have been made into a book.
So you began, though, with someone giving you a camera and you started taking photographs. At what point did you not pursue being a full-time photographer and moved more to be an editor? And what attracted you about being an editor?
Yeah, it's the weirdest coming together of things. I joined the Air Force to get out into outside of my little town in Nebraska, and the recruiter put a book down and with a listing of every job, and I went through it and through it and through it time and time again. I was like, I don't know, I have no clue. Then there was this one that said you could work for a base newspaper, and I had no idea what that meant, but geez, it sounded like better than, you know, being a clerk or a cook or something. So I started by writing stories, and then somebody talked me into buying their camera, and I, oh, okay, I guess I'll take pictures too. And then as an undergrad, I took the news editing, the writing program at University of Nebraska, and took art classes to develop the visual side of my brain a little better. And then mostly was a writer in a little newspaper, but I took photos. Then I went to grad school because I'm gonna be a photographer finally. And then the second year of grad school, Bill Kirkendall said the words picture editor. And I was like, what? What is that? And he started a graphics management sequence at the school. And I jumped on that. And that pointed me to picture editing, thanks to actually a guy named Randall Roberts, who ended up hiring me as a picture editor, the first job.
But at the same time, you've also continued to make your own photographs throughout the years as well. I mean, what are the sorts of things that you've sought to photograph, and what led you to photograph those topics?
What I photographed in most is the flow of life that I was a part of when we'd get together with friends, for family gatherings. And then in Portland, Oregon, a bunch of us, 5 of us, 6 of us started to photograph cyclocross racing every weekend. And there'd be 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 riders doing this crazy form of bicycling. And we ended up creating a website and would post photos every Monday morning and get hundreds of viewers. And it was just a blast. So that, like, whoa, man, maybe I could just specialize. Then my job, I was the editor for the food section in a food magazine, director of photography. And so I started to photograph food because the photographer's like, come on, it's only food. I don't want to do this. So, oh, right, let's see what we can do. And started to try to say things through food photography. And just, that was such a blast. I mean, at some point in the book, I speak to that, you know, always look for the opposite. And that's a hard thing to come across. But in this case, it was like food. How can you make food interesting? Okay, well, try to introduce qualities and aspects, and maybe it becomes more than just food. Yeah. Same for bicycling. I mean, it's never what you photograph that makes the photograph it's interesting. It's what you bring to the making is the premise.
One of the things that really drives the argument and the approach in the book is about asking the question why of project, so on. And we'll get into that in terms of photography projects, photo essays, stories in a moment. But thinking about your own why this book now? What drove you to do this book at this time?
People have been suggesting that I write a book after I've worked with them for quite a few years, especially since I've been doing independent consulting the last, I don't know, 12, 13 years. I didn't feel like I had pulled together everything enough to write a book until I had taught for about 6, 7 years, and trying to make things happen in that teaching environment. And I was teaching from like the basic level to the more advanced levels. And I created my own courses, structure, to curriculum and everything to do that. It was only then, oh, okay, now I see how a book that kind of weaves all of this stuff together into one full concept. And that I can do now, finally. And it defined the book, essentially.
It was the right time, and it took a lot of experience to get to that point of wanting to do it.
Yes, more than 600 projects with photographers independently, and a bunch of staffs and teaching and a bunch of environments. Okay, I think I can do it, and I hope people agree.
Yeah. So the book begins with a very bold statement in the preface. And just to quote that, you say, "There are more ways to make a living through photography now than ever. We're moving away from photography being an add-on to photography being the core medium for expression in a more diverse marketplace." That's pretty optimistic. That's counter to some of the sort of prevailing views in the field. Elaborate on why you feel that this is a new and creative time and why you are optimistic about this moment.
Okay. When I started out, like 90% of the people who made photographs for a living probably did so in publishing environments, most of them in newspapers or wire services or magazines. Through the course of teaching for 8 years, I kept track of where students ended up, what jobs they got. And 90% of them were employed in the visual marketplace. 4 of them, maybe 5, worked for newspapers in 9 years, actually, a year of adjunct. So the places they've ended up reflect the range. Everything from the Library of Congress to Greenpeace, to hospitals, to universities, to any place that has something they're trying to put forward needs visual content these days. And I always love to see that Patagonia has its own photography staff, and so does Under Armour, and it's astounding.
Yeah.
Not only that, it used to be that, okay, I make photographs and I make this kind of photograph. That's probably not enough anymore to make a living. You have to be able to think of concepts, and maybe you need to add in video or know people who can do that, or you're an audio specialist on top of being able to make photographs, or you're able to conceive of whole ideas and then be able to pull those together. That's not a new thing in and of itself. It's just that it's much more typical now and of an expectation. It's sort of baked into if you want to make a living visually, you need more than one skill set and more than one singular way of producing something.
Does having those multiple skills mean that people need to be generalists, or should they still seek to specialize on some things but just have an additional skill? I mean, there's not a formula for these things, obviously, but just thinking about the general direction.
One of the things I realized in writing this book and teaching was everything is on a continuum, on a spectrum. So you can land anywhere on that spectrum. I only make photographs, or I do everything. It's more like, I think the way I think of it is you have to develop a specialization. Marin, I'm forgetting the last name, said once that 3 people who hire creatives, photographers, get on an elevator, and somebody says, "Oh, David Campbell, he's the guy who," and it's up to you to finish that sentence for them by the work you produce. So you do have to specialize in some way. It doesn't mean I only photograph, Yeti cups or something of the sort, but rather you become known for being able to solve visual problems and produce bodies of work in a specific way that nobody else does. So in teaching, what I started to do was move away from specific assignments that everyone did the same at the beginning to gradually more and more general assignments that each student had to bring themselves to and make a whole bunch of decisions that ended up creating their own path to a specialization.
So that's what, yeah. I mean, this is something, there are so many things to get into in this conversation, but one thing we may also get into later is that that this approach suggests that education has to change too, that the way that the visual photography is taught needs to alter so that you can, and it sounds like you changed your approach to teaching. Would that be correct over the years?
Yeah, substantially. It's like from here to here, no question. To the point that the last year, I mean, it used to be that like, here's the standard. If you meet it or you don't. If you meet it and exceed it, you get an A. If you, okay, B, C, all that crap. Well, what if instead the goal were every student achieves a level of work that gets an A? What would it take structurally and in terms of everything that you do in that classroom environment for that to happen? And that I've realized about after 5 years was my goal. So I changed virtually everything. And sure enough, the last semester and a half, almost every student in the courses I taught got an A, and the work deserved it. The standards were actually higher, ironically.
Yeah. One of the key concepts, I think probably the key concept in the book in terms of people approaching the work they do is this idea of the why. Why do you want to do something? Why is it important, and so on. And you say that thinking about the why, which you capitalize, I think which is also good. Thinking about the why is letting the functionality of photographs guide the making of them. Elaborate a bit on that. How does thinking about the functionality of photographs guide the making of them?
So for years, I thought what was photographed, what was in front of you, and it was an external process to make the image. If you just followed these steps and made the pictures in this way, it would be interesting, but probably only if what was in front of you was interesting. So switched it to, well, wait a minute. Going to museums more and more, and I kept looking at the photographs, and I was like, wait a minute, this stuff is not interesting. These photographs are not inherently interesting in terms of what they depict or what they show. I mean, it's a green pepper, come on. But so it is, I realize it's what the photographer brings to the making of an image that makes the images interesting. Or at least elevates what wouldn't be interesting by itself to something worth engaging with. So it is the statement, the impression, the idea, what the photographer is saying through the imagery that you will make an interesting photograph. In other words, why you're making an image, a single image, a collection of images, your life's work, is going to guide every decision in the making and the creation and the engagement and every other decision that you make in producing the work.
You have a number of biographical details throughout the book, and it seems that at some stage you grew up on a farm in Nebraska and had to milk cows, but you did so on a stool that had only one or two legs, which gives you a metaphor of the milking stool, which actually requires 3 legs. And you say that, you need to have a compelling why, you need to have a fully realized aesthetic expression, you need an astute technical application to do good work. You've talked about the why as the first part. Tell us a bit more about the other two, the fully realized aesthetic expression, the astute technical application, and how these things come together.
Sure. The aesthetic expression is really in second chapter of the book, what I call the creative means of expression. So those include light, how you express through light and color, how far you decide from which to make photographs, how you compose the setting in front of you, and then the cumulative effect of those 4 is what I call moment value of the photograph, similar to the idea of the decisive moment. So those collectively are the aesthetic that you bring to the expression. Technical is all of the decisions that are involved in understanding how the photographic process works, the machinery, the notion of light and angularity and all of that stuff. So it's really weaving together the full dynamics.
Yeah, so you mentioned moment value. Let's talk a little bit about what you mean by moment value. Maybe you could also show a couple of examples from photographs that you have where you think that they achieve this. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing for everyone that every time you get into a discussion of this in the book, it seems to me, and this is very important, is that you continually repeat the idea that the why determines the how, but there are particular things, not rules, but particular dimensions or considerations might be a way to think about it, that come together to make this idea of moment value. And this moment value is what creates a good photograph in that sense. Show us a couple of examples, and maybe through,
Sure.
in relationship to why you were photographing these things, how you did it, and kind of your assessment of the moment value of the images.
Yeah, I can do that. One point of clarity, I didn't literally grow up on a farm. I had several relatives who were owned farms and we got to spend a lot of time there, thankfully. So I was a city kid in a town of 1800.
And they still gave you a stool with only 2 legs on. I mean, that's pretty cruel.
Yeah, I think that was an uncle who he had 1 cow just because, yeah, you should have a cow. Whatever. It's like, had this old stool. Anyway. So going back to the notion of, see, here's a photograph. Back to the family note. This was a fishing trip that my dad, my son, and I took, and it was a few years ago. And just the feeling of being in, it's at the point at which the roads end in Canada. And just the feeling of being out there in the morning, and this guy smoked like a factory the whole time. And it's just, what does it feel like? And trying to make a photograph. And for about a split second, the background was in shade and the sun was poking through, and boom. So it's the coming together of lots of different things to create moment value, but also that, okay, clarity of what you're trying to express in the moment value. Another family photo of my wife. She's doing yoga here. I mean, it's something that happens every day, and yet can you try to bring together elements? Part of moment value is just not just what's happening in the present tense, but I think of photographs often have a past, a present, and a future. So in this case, the fact that the wheelbarrow's there and that pair of, work gloves are sitting on there suggests, wow, something had happened for those to be there. And there's a cup sitting there, and there's a light on, so which suggests it must be pretty darkish, and the foliage is green, so it's spring and luscious time in Syracuse. And so there's a sense, and it had rained, obviously. So moment value isn't just the occurrences, it's what you determine and decide to put together into the photograph. And even like moment value lingers. This is when I'm after a wedding of my wife's family, and just gathering in someone's home, and how photographs have lives, and they stop time in a given moment in a sense. But like 2 of the gentlemen pictured here no longer are alive, and yet they live through these photographs. So moment value is a really powerful thing. It's not just a present tense, oh, I got the peak moment, the guy dunking the ball or whatever. It is how much can you bring together in terms of expression and uniqueness of the setting, so that you're saying more than just that single time, single thing. Here's another. So this bicycle sat outside of the Newhouse School at Syracuse for several years. Somebody had, I think, gone overseas to school and just left the bicycle sitting there. And I made photographs for like 3 years, trying to convey that sense of wow, this thing feels like it's been there forever. And finally, I was coming in early one morning, and this was happening. The snow that, it just felt like, oh my God. And this is I made with my phone. So it's not like about the tool you use. It's the expression. And there are others, but does that convey the notion?
Yeah. Do you think this idea of moment value is something that is part of the intention of the image maker, or is it also something that requires the viewer or the audience to read the image in a particular way? Both.
It's sort of like people will see only what you've put into the photograph. Not everyone will see everything you've put into it, is my impression. How many dynamics can you place in the image for people to respond to? Sometimes that's a very simple expression. Sometimes it's more complex. I struggle with photographs that are so complex that I don't get them. But that's more about me than the maker, probably.
In one of the sections of the book, which I think is particularly interesting, you talk about the way that the camera and the eye see differently. And I mean, this has huge implications for thinking about the notion of documenting and recording and so on, because what you see versus the camera seeing can be different. I mean, this is obviously especially the case now with cameras that can almost literally record in the dark, where we see the eye sees almost nothing, but the camera can still record an image out of extremely low light conditions and so on. It certainly underscores the idea that we make photographs if the camera and the eye are seeing differently. But on what dimensions does the camera and the eye see differently? What are the things that people should think about?
I can show you a couple examples of pairs of photos back to this set. Let's see. So this is an example of how the eye sees. Our eye can only see the oval in the middle of whatever we're looking at. And it doesn't really fully comprehend a foreground element or a background element. So this is a photograph exactly as the eye sees. And it's the default approach for a lot of photographers in making photographs to put the main elements in the middle, to not really fully consider the edges of the frame, to not use the foreground or the background as critical compositional elements. It's a very one plane kind of expression when the goal of photographs is to not see in layers, but rather see the space spatially geometrically. So this is literally just turned around the other way in this setting. And for me, this is much more how the camera sees. You have to use every part of the scene. You have to place elements and create spatial relationships within the setting. There to have a foreground, a middle ground, a background, a further background, to have lines and shapes guide your eye carefully. Start here, then go there, then go there. It's a very different way of seeing from how the camera sees. And once you switch to that mentality and really start to fully understand, I think the difference is that you're so concentrated on the activity that's the only picture you're making. Whereas this, it's letting the activity happen in the context of a setting. Whether it's super close or middle distance like this or further away. Here's another example. This is the typical, here's one of the best winemakers in Oregon, Doug Tennell, who's a former CBS Middle Eastern Bureau chief, formed Brickyard Winery, and he's checking on wines. So you can make the photograph as your eye sees it, and that's fine. You fully understand. This I would call as a verb photograph. Here's somebody doing something. But here's a wider view of the setting of the same activity, still includes the verb, but you have a much more sense. It's a much more spatial expression of the setting. And you have a stronger feeling of what it must be like to carry out this exercise, the number of tasks he's going to be dealing with. So the part of the moment value is the coming together of all four of the things. So there has to be a quality of light that expresses something, and there has to be the color values or the tonalities in black and white have to be fully realized. Okay, this one is made from a sort of observational distance. This one is made from a further view, like stepped back view, very different perspective. Just like, so here's another super relatively tight view of this. This is an amazing kind of bicycle race if you've never seen it. It's a stationary with a timer and who has the most revolutions per minute for a period of, I think, 2 or 3 minutes. And it's insane. Yeah. So here's the same setting made even closer. And the distance is the only thing that was really changed. So the feeling, though, is dramatically different between the two. And then the compositional aspect of moment value is literally seeing the space three-dimensionally, and making decisions. Usually, the way I say it is, you think of the setting you're photographing as a stage, and the actors, the people, whatever they're doing, are the actors in that setting. So you have to decide, how much of a setting do I need to say a specific thing? In this case, this hill was just a murderous thing to get up to the top of. So the goal was to create a sense of that just through compositional and lighting and all of the other variables under control. And in this case, by starting people's eyes and the focused point deep into the frame, so that you have to go way down into the setting to begin looking at the photograph. Then you come out to see the other guy. So the compositional choices were based on trying to convey the sense of burden of effort. And that's what I did almost constantly in cycling world, is like the ribbon flow of cyclocross racing is just insane. So in this case, the most important part of this photograph is the two riders way deep in the frame there. And there are two more that just entering the frame. So oftentimes photographs, the most important element in them is the smallest element that holds the whole thing together. Like, I don't think this would be nearly as interesting without those two riders.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is also a good example of that, the difference between what the eye sees and what the camera sees, because in these moments, if you're there and in person, you see that ribbon and you also appreciate how difficult the terrain is, and particularly the gradient and the incline. The camera tends to, in this case, the camera sees a bit less, I think, because the camera flattens out that incline. So you need these other things in the composition. I mean, I'm a cyclist. I've never done cyclocross because it's too insane. But even if you're, out riding alpine climbs and you're taking just snapshots on your phone or whatever, you cannot convey just by doing a snapshot of the road what the gradient is and how difficult it feels, and so on. You need other elements like that. And I think this is a really fantastic example of that perspective of those two people in the distance, and the previous one with the person cycling into the bottom of the climb and the guy carrying the bike at the top of the climb gives you a sense of how difficult it is that would not otherwise be visually evident.
But bringing back that notion of opposites, typically in photography, you photograph the verb, the guy in the foreground would have been the main element of the frame. But when you start to, okay, what am I trying to convey? and where is that happening, and what all needs to fall in place for that to be realized. So the actual, like, instead of the main part of the photograph being in the foreground and concentrating on, I got to get that, I got to get that.
Yeah.
I was actually watching that space in the background
Right.
to make sure that that was filled. And I just kept pushing the shutter and let the damn camera make the verb part of the photograph. And you as the photographer are in charge of making everything else fall into place.
Yeah. Let me bring in a couple of questions that people in the audience are asking. And just a reminder to folks in the audience, please put questions in the Q&A box so I can easily keep track of them and bring them into the conversation where appropriate. Gorev was asking, he says, I really like the photograph of your wife doing yoga. Hearing you describe the early morning scene, I'm slightly curious as to why you decided to image it in black and white. Or more generally, how do you approach the subject and the surroundings in the scene with complex natural light?
It's interesting that generally started in color. All of the cycling photographs are in black and white because cyclocross outfits are just crazy mixtures of colors. And we were trying to convey that sense of continuity of effort, and not, if they had to work in color, they would have been very different photographs. So that explains that. I've been doing wildlife photography the past year and a half, and that's all in color. The book, I was limited to only a handful of color photographs, so some of the ones that would have been better in color are in black and white in the book, but sorry about that.
And the reason for the yoga photograph being black and white, was there a particular reason for that one?
I think the mood and the quality, the wheelbarrow is green, and it would have drawn your eye much more. And color affects an image in three primary ways. It first creates a mood. It's warm, it's cool, it's crazy, it's whatever. And then it directs the eye. If you see it poorly, you go to the green wheelbarrow instead of to my wife first. And then it also creates separation within the frame, something brighter, or yellow, the opposites of colors in the setting will create separation between those elements.
One of the, at one point, we've started talking about some of the technical things, which is good, and we'll get on to sequencing in a moment. But even when you're discussing in the book some of the technical matters, you also urge people to get, quote, out from behind the camera and learn about medium, the history of the medium, and so on. So I was thinking about that in relationship to a question that Tequila has asked. He says, if you've been programmed to make pictures like the first images you show, maybe the first images you have seen, can you recommend how to retrain your approach?
Well, one thing, if you do find yourself putting the primary element in the middle of the frame frequently, challenge yourself to not do that. This here's an example of that. I intentionally said, okay, I don't want anything in the middle of the frame, and yet it's still got to hold together. Here too, it's the guy up in the top left of the frame that completes it. Another thing to do is look for triangulated elements within the setting that are at different depths within the frame that are visually connected. What that means, so this guy connects to this guy, connects to this guy, and visually, and they create a plane within the frame that makes it feel deep. Then you come back and you see this guy additionally, and then, oh, that's triangulation. The boards, those are very carefully placed within the frame at those angles, against the bridge, against the steps, so that each of those is very geometrically, spatially placed. So chances are if you build those verb-based kinds of imagery, you're only thinking about the one layer of the setting. So start to force yourself to see the whole of a setting and decide how much you want to show, how close you need to be. Try to have a sense of where things are going to happen, build the frame of complete composition, knowing where things might fall into place, then adjust the framing as things evolve. And make enough frames, push the button enough times for everything to fall into place.
If we get to the idea of selecting and sequencing, which of course is a big part of the book and a big part of your approach, you've got quite a number of sort of practical tips about how people can, once they've made that large number of frames, how they can make selections, how they can sequence and so on. Talk us through some of what you think are the most important practical things that people can do if they've photographed a lot and they want to start to put together a narrative, how to select and sequence images for a narrative.
It's a big question.
Yes.
In the book, I described a process that I use, and it's basically making 6 to 7 passes through the images and creating these are better, these are better, these are better, these are better, hierarchy within the images. So the process of defining, okay, well, why is this one better than this one? What did I do here that I didn't do? Or what did I do with a better image that I didn't do there? So just the process of doing that becomes a learning experience if you do it thoughtfully. There's a self-assessment at each step. So once you've gotten to an upper level of the work that you've made, the use of the images, what kind of a space they're going to exist in, will determine how you're going to sequence them. And if you are, for instance, just doing a slideshow for your website, what I often suggest is just choose the first image. Let me explain something first. Basically, there are two ends of a spectrum of the continuum to sequencing. One is purely informational. You know, what are you showing? What does the caption say? And then at the other is a purely lyrical, and where the flow of what you've expressed and what you're saying and the visual qualities of the imagery play one into the next, and the visual experience plays in one to the next. So my preference is leaning toward the right side of that spectrum with a sense or an understanding of the left, so that they both make sense, but not letting the informational guide. Ironically, most publishing environments, because they're driven by we used to call word people, and I'm redefining that. Actually, Todd Heisler suggested reading this book, and it's making me understand the publishing world especially very differently, in that they aren't just word people, there are visual thinkers and there are verbal thinkers. So if you understand which you are and which the people you're working with are, you can work much more effectively. I used to say that you have to translate your visual job to word people, and that's literally what it is, because we think differently. Anyway, the sequencing though, so for a more visually driven sequence, I choose the first image, show you more specifically how to do it. Say I built this sequence actually just for the potential, and put it on the left side of the screen. This is photo mechanic. Lightroom has the compare space, and then scroll through all of the other images.
I don't think we're seeing that at the moment.
Oh, sorry. I forgot to hit share.
Yeah.
You got to share. That's one of the lessons trying to work on with my grandson these days. So split screen view, choose what you think of is the first image in this case that has this feeling of beginning, of burdens of work, of, oh my God, I can't believe I'm just exhausted looking at this. I hope. And she's an amazing writer. And then, well, what are the dynamics that you can play into, in this case, single writer, multiples, crappy weather, a different kind of crappy weather, a certain number of things stay consistent, a certain number change. Or do you want to go to like, okay, really muddy and cruddy and too dusty and hot and very distant to very close? The light doesn't work so well going from this one to that one, I think. So similar effort, similar posture. It's really hard to go from that image to that one. Right. Too much alike. That has some similar dynamics, so it's not quite enough experiential. There's some variability. Anyway, you get a sense. In this case, I think going from this one to this one was the strongest.
Because you talk in the book about, I mean, you could create a sequence as kind of a linear narrative where, you know, this happened first, this happened second, this happened third, but then more significantly about the relationship between images. And what you've demonstrated there is like searching for that relationship between images in terms of the compositional elements as well as the subject itself.
You bet. And all 5 of those dynamics play. It's also generally true that where you leave one photograph is where you will start another, right, whether it's in a book environment or slideshow or gallery, maybe less so gallery. So that's a powerful dynamic you can use in sequencing. Directionality.
Similar to moves in filmmaking, where, you know, someone will move out through a door and the next scene might be someone going in through a door, so that those 2 scenes get completely different people to suit different situations, but the scenes are linked together.
You bet. And that's a great point. Transition or the flow in films is a good learning place for sequencing still images. I think a lot of the same principles.
So what you were showing there with the sequence you were working in, obviously working digitally, electronically, and photomechanic. Ken was asking a bit earlier that at some points too, you've printed out images and laid them out on tables and so on. Do you still advocate the idea of, at some stage in the process, people printing out, or is that simply a different way of doing it to operating digitally?
Part of that depends on where it's going to live. The best thing you can do, I think, is to do both. Like, do it digitally first and see what happens, then make prints of the selections, and then put those out. A really good thing you can do with prints too is, even if you think you're done with the project, make rows that share qualities, like this photograph and this one show similar things, or these are both about anger or whatever holds them together. And for a given body of work, how many different rows are you creating? Will speak to the range of the work you've produced. Another step you can do then is move the stronger images forward in each row. And then if that tells you, okay, I've only got 2 really good photographs in this row that speaks to a really important aspect, and I've got 20 in this one. So, oh my God. If you do this as you progress through a project, it helps you, oh, I better stop spending time here and spend more time there. It also helps guide the effort. And then once you've done that, when you're at the end, you can use that then to refine the process of creating the sequence by pulling more from the front of the rows instead of it being this massive sea of images.
The book is full of lots of little, I think of them as epitaphs, little phrases that really congeal complex thoughts in them. And one is where you say, in talking about narrative, you say, understand that subject matter does not a story make. Unpack that for us, because I think that's a pretty important notion, that subject matter doesn't make a story by itself. What are you suggesting?
I got that from someone else. I've forgotten now, but it became clear in reading several hundred, several thousand Alexia Grant proposals that people who think the subject that they're photographing, just because that has some dynamic, they go in and make pictures of that, and therefore there's great value.
Yeah.
As compared to the people who actually found an element within that setting that was incredibly compelling and rose above the factual or the circumstantial aspects of what was pictured. It's the difference between a collection of photographs on a subject and a visual experience that takes you through an environment.
Yeah, I think it's significant because it repeats and kind of underscores something that we've heard here on 7 Insider in our conversations with photo editors that we've had, where people are saying, I've done work on X and I've sent it to an editor and I didn't get a response. And a couple of them have made the very good point that, yes, you've sent work that is about refugees in Europe, but what's the story? What's the particular angle on that? Just saying it's about refugees in Europe is not sufficient to actually put a story together or get it published or get the attention you need. Is there a character? Is there a person? Is there a particular event? Is there a particular way into that? So on. So there's a big difference between topic and subject and story in that sense. Just think that's really worth underlining to people, because that's how you get the attention of editors and how you get the attention of the audience too. Right?
That's super well said.
Go on, sorry.
Another way to think about that is a lot of people think it's beginning, middle, end, or people go through transition and change and stuff. And there's certainly, that's most films, especially like Disney films and Cinderella and stuff. In still photography, that's certainly an option, but there's so many other ways to go about producing narrative that are dependent on what you're trying to convey, and building out not just photography, but other expressions within a setting.
Yeah. Let me ask some of the questions that people in the audience have posted in the Q&A box. So they cover a variety of different topics. From Tim, he's asking, as an editor and instructor, what do you feel are some of the most common traps that emerging or developing photographers fall into that hold them back from realizing their full potential, especially those aspiring to produce long-form documentary work?
One of the goals I realized you had to have as a teacher was helping students overcome whatever it was that kept them from producing to their potential. So that was my job. And to put that challenge in front of people and help them walk through it. If you don't have someone who's going to help you do that, then it's dependent on you to figure out, okay, what is keeping me? A very simplistic example, one student wanted to be a travel photographer, but they didn't really like people and photographing people. So, okay, let's work through that. They ended up finding another specialty that was much more fascinating to them, and they produced amazing work. So there are things like that. Then the second step is recognizing that this is not an external process. Photography is not learning how machines work and and thinking that if you make photographs of a thing, that's going to be interesting, because it is. It is you getting to the point of understanding what you can say from yourself, and that the machine you're using is just an extension of that. And then understanding all the dynamics that it takes for you to achieve that expression. So it's the opposite again at play. It's not external, it's all internal, and moving forward from clarity within to achieve clarity in the expression through a photograph.
A comment and a question from Josefina. I love the photo of the wedding with your Chinese relatives. I like what you said about the photo being past, present, and future. How does that concept apply to the specific photograph? Are you always taking photographs in all events of your life? Or do you already know what the things that interest you are, and so you bring the camera to those specific times?
Well, I tend to photograph things that are happening. So it's more of a response, forming an impression, and oh, what can I speak to here? And it doesn't have to be overly heavy or anything. Oh, and family is Korean, just for the record. Quite a bit of difference there. Let me show you one photograph. Where is it? So I saw these, the boys. To me, this has beginning, middle, and end, or like past, present, future in it very much. And it was, I saw the two boys before they had run across it and thought there might be a photograph. So I positioned myself with that little front loader and the pile of gravel and stuff and framed it. And sure enough, the kids ran through it. So I talk about anticipation in the third chapter and many other elements that are about things that you do from behind the camera that aren't photographic, degree of engagement and how you can express time in different ways. And anticipation is one of those. So even like the difference between these two photographs, understanding if you wait, sometimes the photographs get better. This is a few seconds difference of time passing, but the moment value of the one on the right is much stronger by my take. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I think so. Question from Jaime Carrero. So do you see the role of the photographer to be that of a visual director rather than just a chronicler? It seems more personal and powerful than just trying to convey information. Portrait of your wife is a beautiful image.
You bet. Director, producer. Again, it's the difference again between external and internal. It is your voice, your expression, your response to the setting, fully engaged, and then trying to reflect it, the qualities of what's in front of you that produce the greatest result, in my opinion.
Question from Catherine. This is an interesting one. How do you not become numb to the sheer volume of stories that we come across on a daily basis now? And do you have advice for how to find that special quality which makes certain stories shine? If you have the answer to the last one, you'll be able to bottle it and sell it to everyone. But how do you not become numb to the volume of stories that you come across on a daily basis? And what makes special stories stand out?
When I was in grad school, the dean was James Atwater, and he was an editor at Time magazine, one of the top before he became dean at Missouri. And I made photographs for him and volunteered just to be around the guy because he was amazing. And he told me once that, he reads 11 newspapers a day when he was working at Time, usually on the train into Manhattan. 11 newspapers? What? And several magazines too. And he says, well, I don't read every word. I just, I scan, and what is important stands out. So the same, in looking at the volume, like I don't spend much time on Instagram because so much of it is not interesting. Um, so I try to learn about people and producing work and then filter more for their work. And that's a constant. I'll spend 2, 3 hours a day trying to understand and learn and gain a library of work. Less so now, but when I was teaching, for sure, usually between 5 and 7 a.m., it's nothing but sucking it in and pointing as many sources to you as possible that you trust and might produce surprises. The filter is surprise. Like, whoa, I've seen this before 100 times, but not like this. I mean, there's really nothing new, but there might be new approaches.
Yeah.
And that's where you come in as the creator, is coming up with freshness.
A technical question from John. Do you have thoughts about flash or strobes? He says he finds it difficult to take photos with more depths or layers when the flash illuminates whatever is closest.
When I was photographing food and in the restaurant world, and a lot of other settings in Portland, I used strobe in almost every one. You probably wouldn't recognize that it was. My sort of principle is, unless you want the introduced light to be the dominant voice in a given photograph, or there's no choice but to illuminate artificially, the guide is that if a setting has no quality of light, then you do have to introduce one. Or if the level of the light is so low, then you can elevate that level by introducing light.
Question from Amy, which I think has kind of two elements to it. Knowing how important the sequencing of images is, what are some of your favorite apps, tools, or websites for creating digital or physical artifacts that keep the photographer's intent while also taking advantage of the media they are being shown in? So I think that it has two parts. One is maybe the tools and apps for the sequencing itself, but then also the tools, apps, or websites for actually presenting the work. Do you have any favorite approaches that keep the photographer's intent, but also kind of leverage those particular platforms or technologies?
Well, just in software, there are quite a few, but I use either Photo Mechanic is my go-to for sequencing, just because it's freestanding. You don't have to create substructures or collections and all that stuff. Lightroom is another option. I use that for my own work, but for looking at other people's works, I use Photo Mechanic. I mean, there's Capture One, and Bridge is like a really bad choice, I think, for sequencing and selecting and hierarchy. And then for spaces, I mean, I don't know. There's a resource guide in the back of the book that has a bunch of web platform spaces and book publishers, and it's like a skim the surface of that world, even though it's several pages long. So
question from Torsten in Finland. I'm interested in how you think about teaching photography and the changes in your thinking about how to evaluate photographers' efforts. What kinds of prompts or assignments or suggestions do you give to students before asking them to go into the world with their cameras?
It's good to hear from you, Torsten. We go way back. There's a section in the back of the book also that's a collection of assignments that I've built over years that are intended to get exactly what you're talking about. The main thing is not creating assignments where everybody has to do the same thing for the most part. And another is that every assignment should produce multiple image results. And then just as the progression of experience increases, the complexity of the multiple image results grows, building in how photographs would exist in multiple settings with greater complexity as the courses advance as well. The critical thing, I think, is not letting students go forward until they have a clear understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. You know, you lay out an assignment that's very general and they have to bring themselves to it. Even like one of the first ones I do is that you photograph an event, and an event could be someone combing their hair or, you know, Woodstock. So they have to define what kind of an event space they would be interested in entering. And then, okay, what are you trying to accomplish by photographing in that setting, and expecting them to get to know the people involved in advance of the event and figure out a narrative or a structure or a story that they could tell within the setting. So always, even in the most basic of settings, how far can you help them elevate their understanding of what they could say? And holding them to a standard that is more than just going and making pictures, and then judging the merit of those pictures on some standard.
Yeah. From Alison, she missed the recommendation on the book that Todd Heisler suggested to you that you held up for visual. What's it called? It's
Temple Grandin, rather, Visual Thinking.
Visual Thinking. Yeah, excellent. From Tony, what experience do you have working with writers on assignment? Would you encourage photographers to develop their own writing? Have you done this yourself?
I started out writing for sure and added photographs, and I haven't written that much other than this book. Yeah, I have a lot of experience with working with writers. I think there are visually capable writers and there are not visually capable writers, and understanding in the environment in which you work, which people are which, makes your time much more efficient. Focus on those that are, and the editors in the environment their job is to try to help educate those that aren't in ways that maybe makes them understand how working with visual people can enhance what they're doing. It's one of the hardest things. Editors, word editors, section editors, so many. I started out, we were like seemingly at odds. And over the course of a few months, almost without exception, we became like the best of partners. But it was an educational process. It was a giving. I was saying, like, you have to be a brick wall that's covered by a mattress. So people can bounce off enough times. You have to hold a standard, but then you start by saying, I want to do whatever it takes to make this the most successful it can be. Can we agree to that? And then here's what that means for me. And explaining this stuff in terms that they can understand is a really important thing.
Yeah, Tony followed up about what makes a good match in terms of teaming up with writers, and I guess, you know, it's hard to know in advance. What you're suggesting there is kind of it's a negotiation process with someone.
It is, but also, I mean, writers tend to write about the past. You need to be in the present. So if you go into places with writers, you have to explain and agree, okay, here's what I would need to happen for me to be able to make engaging photographs. What they would need to happen is probably sit down with the person or the people and talk to them so they can bring back life from the past. So working through that negotiation and over time encouraging the writers to be as observational as you are. It's astounding how few writers write observational stuff, except for like drives me nuts when writers describe the hotel in which they had the interview with the actor in great detail, as if, what does that matter? So really, I mean, just developing that relationship and, okay, here's what I think I could respond to in the photographs and speak to. And then if they can get on board with the writing, then whoa, it becomes magical.
Yeah.
Torsten and David Stabler were like that in Portland, writer David Stabler. And they did this story. They decided the secret life of pianos, because David was the musician, writer, and an accomplished musician. And they found these pianos, like one of Hitler's that was in a horse stabler, and all kinds of the prison's piano. And what happens to pianos when they die? And it was just amazing.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of our time. We've taken a lot of your time, which has been fantastic. There'll be, if someone wants to drop in 1 or 2 more questions, we'll have those. I've got a couple to ask and then a point to finish with. But a question from Branko, he says it's for me, but actually I think it's for you, Mike. How do you look on additional interventions on photographs, such as added writings or drawings, in terms of documentary photography? Would you approve of the act of taking a sketch or drawing or writing instead of taking a photograph at a certain moment, and using a drawing instead of a photo in a documentary sequence?
I think what you're trying to express guides the process of what you're going to produce. So anything can work if it expresses what you're trying to say. And I heard an often misconception about what documentary means. Read several books on documentary photography and got into the history of it. And documentary, its principle is, the only difference, as I understand, is that you started from a more pointed viewpoint and you're trying to change and correct and offer your impression of it. And in early days, a lot of different approaches to image making and expression were brought to the fore to accomplish that. At some point, when photojournalism became part of, like in the 1920s, 30s, somehow documentary got infected with the same principles as photojournalism. And that's not the case at all. If you want to do photojournalism, great. Use those standards, principles, but documentary is something very different and can be.
Yeah, so there is space to add that writing on the photographs, beside the photographs, different forms of visuals, archive images, etc.
I was so excited to see World Press Photo's open category along those lines.
Yeah, to broaden that out, definitely. The subtitle of the book is A Fresh Approach to Making a Living as a Photographer. And of course, we could talk for hours about the challenges of that and so on. And I actually think what we've discussed, particularly in terms of the why and specialization, but having additional skills, is probably the most important practical recommendation about making a living as a photographer, is to understand your why and your purpose and develop that and so on. You've got some great points about how to develop pictures towards the end of the book and some practical things. But if you had to think of 1 or 2 things that you would focus on, so someone who has thought about their purpose, their why, and so on, 1 or 2 practical pieces of advice that you would give for making a living in the contemporary environment, what would they be?
I guess there are 2 parts: the achieving your specialization, producing enough work to represent that. Basically, you make the work that you want to produce to make a living from, and then finding a market for that. And the market may not be this traditional editorial, journalistic, or commercial, or whatever. It might be a mix. Defining the market is one, I think, that has been a de facto kind of thing in the past, and it's a much more self-driven, self-defined kind of thing now. Who would have thought you could make a living as a sort of photograph life as it happens in the outdoor space in so many different ways now, for example.
Final question, kind of about education. I think you've touched on this a couple of times in various ways, but it's worth concluding with. How do you set up your lessons when you're teaching so they draw out the student to create assignments that are relevant to the student's interests?
The critical thing, like what is essentially the student's second course at Newhouse, the structure was you photograph an event and you have to define, as I spoke to, then you photograph a place and you define what place means. Then you photograph a person, probably that you've met in that setting. And between those three things, I think virtually every photograph ever made was one of those three things. So then you help each student uniquely define, okay, what would engage you in terms of an event? Is it activity-based? Is it place-based? Is it an individual-based, that kind of thing? What kind of a place or a setting would you want to spend time making photographs and engaging with fully? If you don't invest yourself in it, it's probably not going to be successful. So you have to care about this. And that alone opens up, what? You're not just going to tell me what to photograph?
Yeah.
And then, okay, of all the people you met in that setting, who do you think would make the most compelling set of photographs if you followed their life or entered their life? And then that inherently led to the next semester is a project-based course where they also have to introduce other media and figure out how it's going to exist in real spaces. And each time, though, I mean, there might be a course correction. Whoa, I tried that. Oh, I don't want to do that again. Or they're like, oh man, that was it. I'm in. There's a couple examples of that in the book, but
yeah. So Mike,
I'm sorry, just that moment when students it's like door opening and light. It just is amazing. Real clarity of purpose.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I suspect we could go on for a very long time still, but I think we've covered a lot of territory. Just a reminder to people that the book is called Creating Visual Narratives Through Photography, a Fresh Approach to Making a Living as a Photographer, published by Routledge. The link is on the event page on the 7 Insider website. And Tony's given me the perfect question to conclude with, which is as he says, the ubiquitous and essential question, which is, what was the best piece of advice you ever received from a great teacher that encouraged you when you were emerging?
When I was in grad school, Mike Zerbe, was a Minneapolis Star Tribune photographer for many years. We went out to a small town, and we as a class engaged with the community and made pictures. And I came back and I was so excited because I'd photographed within the school and made these photographs I'd never made, kind of thing. And he said to me, it seems like you like this, that you like this thing you're doing. And I was like, wait a minute, you can actually like this stuff? The notion of making a living can be pleasurable. It's a seemingly small thing, but it has, yeah. And Mike's still a good friend. We're having breakfast on Friday, so.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you so much once again. That's been fantastic. I really do urge people to go and get the book and read it. I think it covers this range from the very practical to the very thoughtful about how to do good work, and it's the best summation of an approach that I've seen for that, drawing on extensive experience. So thanks for talking us through that, Mike, and I'm sure we'll be having a conversation again before too long.
Thank you so much.
All right.
It's been such a pleasure reconnecting with you. Okay.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone in the audience. There's lots of appreciation coming in for you, so thanks everyone for joining us. See you later.